Hey folks, Rob here bringing another tutorial. This is going to be part 3 of a 5-part series of Chapter G. We're going to be covering landing craft, beaches, and the amphibious assault. So the first two videos are on landing craft, they're already up on the channel. I highly encourage you to watch those if you want to follow along in the series. And this one's going to be followed by two that deal with an actual amphibious assault where we combine everything together into the one video. So let's get into it. I found this graphic on the Facebook group, ASL Facebook. So if you're not part of that, I highly recommend you join the community. A lot of good information there and contacts, if you will. I found this from Louis Calcada. Nice little graphic of this. I believe this is an LFT board that he used for his example, but it's a one-shot synopsis of what a beach is. So barring hassle type maps, beaches are usually done with overlays and or geoboards. So there's basically 7 beach kinds of overlays. They're all roughly the same except for BE7, which is where the river joins the sea. There's also 4 ocean overlays as well, so you can have quite a bit of map board taken up by your overlays depending on how many maps you have. So they're designed for either on the edge of the board or on the width of the board. So to look at this graphic, basically the takeaways that we want to learn are going to be the 3 types of slope that you can have with a beach. So these are them right here. We have the slight, moderate, and we have the steep. And each one determines how many hexes of shallow ocean that you have. Reminder that ocean is a water obstacle, and if it's in deep ocean and you're not in a boat or an amphibious vehicle that's been waterproofed, then you're down. You're sunk to the bottom, and your opponent will be able to claim those victory points. Same thing if you're swamped. If you are say a duplex drive tank like on D-Day and you're driving through heavy surf like they did, you could get swamped, and in the deep ocean down goes your tank and your opponent gets the points for it. So again, your slope will determine the 1 to 3 hexes that you're allowed for shallow water. Steepest is obviously the most severe. You only have 1 margin of error, and then you have your beach hexes. Now, the beach hexes themselves, they can actually be a variable number. They're not determined by the slope of the beach. All this does is determines typically what kind of sand you're going to encounter, as well as how many hexes shallow ocean. So that's what the slope indicates. Beaches could be anywhere from 1 to 4. So, for example, in the scenario JM2 in Journal 4, which is Bloody Omaha by Daniel Zucker, he's got 4 hexes of beach with I believe it's a slight slope. So there's a lot of beach for them to run over, a lot of open ground. All right. So we have our 3 slopes, typically specified by SSR, or again, design your own based on your own historical research. And there's 2 types of sand we worry about. So we have hard and we have soft sand. So before we get into the sand, let's look at those 3 slopes in depth. All right, so a slight slope, very shallow grade, you're going to have 3 hexes of shallow water. And you're basically, while you're at technically a -1 level, it's treated as level 0 for lines of sight purposes because the relative flatness of the terrain. Contrast that with a moderate sloped beach. In this case, again, you're going to be at, you're technically -1, however, you're considered at level 0 for purposes of line of sight, and each beach and ocean hex is treated, or shallow ocean hex is treated as a dare. So this is Chapter F, the desert rules, and you can see the information down below at the bottom of the slide. It's basically like a concave depression with a lip around it. So you can see from lip to lip, but you can't necessarily see what's in the next one. So any kind of elevation you're going to have on the shore, the hinterland, obviously will let you see into the dares, but you will be able to get some TEM because of the nature of the waves and the sand, that you're going to be able to get a +1 TM versus direct fire only. And then lastly, we have a steep slope. Now, steep slopes, as you can imagine, are going to be the hardest ones. Again, you're going to be at a -1 compared to the hinterland. And it does form a crest line. So again, if you look at our graphic, for example, hinterland beach would be a hinterland beach hexside, beach ocean, etc. If your hinterland butts up directly against the ocean, that would form a cliff where the water level would be at a -1 and all cliff rules would apply. Because this is a crest formation for a steep slope, you are able to gain crest status, much like in a gully. So if you're down on the beach, you can inch your way up to the top and you can have eyes on the, you get some direct fire protection from the crest status. All right, so the sand is going to be one of two types. We have hard and soft. Now, hard sand is hopefully what you're going to face most of the time. Again, sand uses the chapter F7 rules for sand, and a lot of it's based on EC conditions and slope. So if you have hard sand, you cannot be a steep sloped beach unless the EC are, as you can see, wet mud or snow. In terms of movement, terrain effect, and bog, it's treated like a sand hex, like I said. Again, you can see the information down the bottom left. If you look at the exception, which is especially important here, all non-cost of terrain movement factor and movement points are reduced by 1 if EC are wet or mud. So barring those two types of EC conditions, you're still going to be paying for infantry. We have 1 plus cost of terrain, so 2, cavalry, etc. Unless you have wet or mud EC conditions, in which case the infantry would only pay 1 and you'd be reduced by 1. So just remember that as well. Sand is +0. However, any ordnance versus a unarmored target is going to be have firepower because of the cushioning effects of the sand. All right, so whether it's hard or soft, it's not going to matter, but you do get some protection from fire. And of course, any vehicles in hard sand are also going to have to worry about bogging. That's just part of the nature of driving up on the beach. And anytime you make a vehicle covered arc change or enter a new hex, you'll have to make your bog die roll. When it comes to soft sand, typically you'll only find this on steep sloped beaches, again, barring SSRs. It is bog terrain, much like hard sand, and it's a bitch to move through. As you can see, the movement point cost and the terrain effect are all increased, and the only exception might be the ignoring the exception in 7.3. Regardless of the EC conditions, you would ignore that exception. So even if you're in a steep slope beach and the EC conditions are wet, you do not get the reduction in movement cost. All right, so let's look at an example here. So this is obviously Japanese PTO. We have some British coming on, various landing craft. And again, I've tried to mimic Lewis's graphic. Reminder, steep, moderate, and slight slope are going to be important for what we're going to be doing here. Now, once more, for deep ocean, both deep and shallow ocean constitute water obstacles. And typically with a water obstacle, unless you're an amphibian or a landing craft boat, you're gone. So just remember that. Shallow ocean is a little bit different. It's still a water obstacle. However, you're allowed to wade. You're not forwarding, you're wading. So there's a bit of a naming difference in the rule books itself. All right, when it comes to waterproofing and amphibians, if we look at this is a Sherman Firefly, we can see that there's no superscript beside the move, which means he's not an amphibian. If we want to look at an example of that, let's bring in a Sherman 3, excuse me. And here we can see that it does have a 2 in the superscript, which means it has a second kind of movement, and typically that's going to be amphibious movement. So if we look at our landing craft, we have a 5 move. We look at our Sherman 3, and we only have 2 moves. So once the screens are up on these duplex drive tanks, by the way, if you didn't know, they have propellers in the back, and they had an air-equipped screen that would erect itself and basically give the tank some buoyancy so it could float through the water. Now, your crew is typically hatches down except for the commander, who had a tiller bar that was able to steer, and because of his high status, he's able to see over the screens. But your driver is basically just keeping his foot on the gas with props going kind of stuff. So very scary. In D-Day, they actually trained the crews. They had some kind of quasi-scuba gear, and they were able to swim out of these tanks if they were to go down. So while in game terms you're going to lose the tank, realistically your crew has a pretty good chance of being able to swim out of the tank as it's sinking down. All right, so we have amphibians, which have a superscript, and we have non-waterproof vehicles, which do not. So a non-waterproof vehicle obviously needs to be on some kind of conveyance, in this case a landing craft. These are the LCT-4s, and if you look at this one up here, let's spin it around, you can see that portage points, 330. Now, each vehicle, weapon, squad, crew, what have you, except for leaders who don't count for portage points, 4 or less don't count for one. Everything costs portage points, and you look at your chart, you find your vehicle in the Chapter H notes, what it costs for the Sherman 5s. I believe they are the 60 portage point cost. They're around the 28 to 33 ton size, and so each of these two cost 60, 120. We tack on a gun with a half track. Again, you find your weight, and we're well under our 330 portage points. But just remember, there is a larger variant of the LCT-4, which has 500 portage points. Considered very, very large targets, so you're going to suck up some shots, but you can carry more gear. So just remember that. Again, I refer you to my video on landing crafts. All right, so we have amphibians, as we said, with the superscript. Now, once your screens are up, which they must be if you're in deep ocean, you're not going to be swamped. What that means is water's not going to come flowing in your hatches unless there's heavy surf in effect, which we're going to cover at the end of this video. You're not going to have to worry about swamping. Now, the exception, obviously, is your screens must be up. So the minute you enter shallow ocean, let's use a slight slope as a for the purposes of this demo. Let's get those out of the way for now. At this point, again, heavy surf, we'll have to worry about swamping. So typically, your screens on your drive tanks are going to be staying up all the time until you actually hit the sand, in which case you just hit the lever, you drop them, and then you can carry on like a normal AIV. If you have a, say, let's move up our landing craft up here. Landing craft, remember, once they enter shallow ocean, I have to take bog checks. Say he runs aground. All right, so our landing craft has run aground. It got immobilized. It drops its ramp, and now our vehicles can exit. So the first Firefly drives off the ramp into hex 3016. And the first thing we have to do is a swamping die roll because, again, he's not an amphibian. So we make our roll. Now, the only modifiers we're going to add are, if you look on the bottom left, we have a slightly sloped beach, which is 2 times the distance. So we have 2 hexes, so that's going to be a +4. If it's moderately sloped, you have 3 times and then 6 times if it's steeply sloped. So just remember, steeply sloped is a 1 hex shallow ocean, so it's going to be 6 movement points, or sorry, a +6 DRM to your swamping die roll. All right, so what was our roll? We rolled a 6. So let's move into the next hex. Remember, this is costing move, which we're going to look at in a second here, so we won't cover that now, but he's going to move up to the next hex. Again, he's going to have to do a swamping die roll. This time we only have a +2 because we only have 1 hex distance. And again, that's only an 8. As long as you don't get a 12, we're good. And then finally, we move into this last hex here. Now we're at 0, so we don't have any modifiers. We just do our bog check. And again, we're fine. So now we can enter the beach, assuming, of course, that we had the move. Now, if you contrast that with an amphibian, so let's bring up our Sherman 3. Same thing. It comes on with screens up. And because let's assume that we don't have heavy surf, this tank can continue moving. He does not have to worry about a swamping die roll because his screens are up. All right, so that's the difference between the two, the amphibian and the non-waterproofed, non-amphibian vehicle. All right, so when it comes to shallow water, let's deal with infantry first. We'll move up our landing craft. Again, we'll say for whatever reason, this one here had a shitty day. He rolled a bog check and he becomes immobilized in the shallow ocean water in hex 4081. And again, he's going to drop his ramp. And now the units can start exiting. Remember, infantry, you can exit any order. It's only vehicles that must exit in the order that they're stacked top to bottom. So in this case here, we can send out one squad, jumps into the hex that the vehicle got grounded in, and immediately he could come under some kind of fire. There are various modifiers we have to, so let's look at that. Now, any HE and or DC firepower is always going to be halved. Now, the consequences of being in shallow water are that you cannot do any close combat. There's no multi-hex fire groups, so you got to be everything inside a hex. Leaders cannot direct fire. You cannot use support weapons except for light machine guns, which you can fire, you pick them up, you fire. However, again, all that fire is going to be halved, as well as any non-vehicular gun. You cannot obviously set up a gun in the shallow water. Even if you're sitting here right on the edge of the beach, you cannot do it. Any unpossessed support weapons or guns are lost. So, for example, this Bangalore and this 457, let's say they make it up to here and then the squad is killed. This is lost, right? So anything that's unpossessed, whether it's a gun or a support weapon, will be lost in shallow water if it's unpossessed. The only difference to that would be if it's on some kind of conveyance. So let's say, for sake, that we had our 457 as a rider on the vehicle, and we fire some machine guns. For whatever reason, we don't target the tank. The squad is destroyed. Because this is on the conveyance, the Bangalore would be safe, and only the squad would count for death. Obviously, if the tank got destroyed, then these units would have to bail out, and they might face certain consequences. Just remember, if it's unpossessed in shallow water, it's lost. You can obviously not gain concealment except at night if you're out of NBR, because you're wading through the water, trying to keep your rifle above the water. You're obviously not trying to be stealthy and gain concealment. And then I don't have an example here, but if we had a river, you could not wade upriver if it's a heavy current. Obviously, it's too strong. You're not going to be able to wade up to the river itself. Other consequences for infantry in shallow ocean are immunities to pinning task checks, leader loss morale checks, leader loss task checks. You cannot be pinned, and you're immune from heat of battle. We're going to cover more on the amphibious assault part of it later, so there's a couple of things to add to that, but for now, just worry about that. If, say, this tank here fires his machine gun and we suffer a 2MC and we fail, we do not break. You just get casualty reduced, right? Again, any ELR replacement would happen, but you don't become broken. You just get reduced to half squad status. If your half squad fails a morale check, then it'll be gone, because remember, it cannot. You don't break in the shallow water. You just get reduced. Leaders will have to take wound checks, and again, you fail, you're dead. And broken infantry, say we make it to the beach and we break. The only time we're allowed to enter the shallow ocean again is if we have to for failure to route reasons, assuming that no quarters in effect, we could low crawl away. But that's the only reason that broken units can re-enter the water, is to avoid failure to route. Or if you're doing a seaborne evacuation, you have a landing craft, you can then enter that location to get onto the landing craft. So those are the only two cases when a broken unit can enter shallow ocean, either a sea evac or because you're avoiding failure to route. All right, let's look at movement costs. So For shallow ocean, let's look at the chart first. So this is the Chapter G divider PTO terrain chart. If you look at ocean, you have two rows. The first row is going to be for deep ocean, and the bottom row is going to be for shallow ocean. All right, so again, depending on what it is, infantry, you're paying 3 move, cavalry, horses, all movements, vehicles, etc. And if you look at the deep ocean, obviously it's NA, because once more, if you're not amphibian, that's been waterproof, screens up, or in a landing craft / boat, you're done. And I failed to mention it, but your opponent gets victory points for stuff you lose at sea, so just bear that in mind. All right, so obviously you cannot ride motorcycles, even off landing crafts, in shallow ocean, and watercraft themselves do not expend any extra to cross a beach ocean hex side or ocean hinterland hex side. You're basically in the process of beaching, you don't pay extra moves. Any wading vehicle, let's look at those for a second. Any ordnance attack versus a wading vehicle is going to be affected with a +2 to hit. And exiting a shallow ocean hex, you only have to make the bog check if you're going into an ocean hinterland hex site, not ocean beach hex site. So a subtle difference there. And D16.3, 16.23, excuse me, just refers to amphibians and water obstacles and waterline hexes when moving from water obstacle to land hex. So amphibians must check for bog. This is ignored for wading vehicles entering from shallow water. All right, so let's look at reefs quickly. These will typically be in Pacific. You're not going to see them in the Northwest Europe, D-Day, and that kind of area. They only exist by SSR or design your own, and are either exposed or submerged. Now, any hex between the reef and the beach shore will not be affected by things like heavy surf, and it's always considered shallow water, and regardless of the slope of the beach. If you have 10 hexes between the reef and the beach, those 10 hexes will all be wadeable, even if it's a steeply sloped beach. As we said, heavy surf does not apply between the two, and it's considered like a level -1 hamada. So once more, we look at Chapter F rules. Hamadas are little hills if it's exposed. Now, there's no mud effects from this, and there's no immobilization die roll for running aground required for watercraft adjacent to an exposed reef. If it's submerged, you cannot see it. There's going to be a bog check where you'll very likely will ground out on the reef itself. You cannot enter and set up in a reef, although again you could cross that hex side to disembark your contents. And a submerged reef hex is considered a shallow ocean hex itself. So, all right, so let's look at heavy surf. Now, heavy surf, I would not say is optional, but rarely, because it throws a mess into the spanner, into the works, it's probably going to be not put into most scenarios, just because it adds extra difficulty for the attacker. If half your forces don't make it to the beach, it's going to be a very weak scenario, and therefore most scenario designers are not going to implement that. So again, so heavy surf is typically specified by SSR. Heavy winds will always be in effect for the duration of the scenario, so there's not going to be any wind change. You can do the wind change die roll because there's other things that might be factored in, but the wind itself will not change. You're always going to have heavy winds. You're always going to have a current, so it might behoove you, if it's not specified, to have a look at the historical records. For example, where the forces landed on D-Day, the current drifted from the northwest to the southeast. So when you're in your advanced phase as part of heavy surf, you're going to be drifting. You may want to factor just to keep more historical. It can only occur in ocean hexes, so reminder, reefs to shore, no heavy surf applies. It's only the hexes that are not covered by that. Every vehicle can be swamped, including watercraft and waterproof vehicles, amphibians. When it comes to swamping in shallow ocean, here we have our landing craft again. The landing craft would fail its roll, let's say, and it becomes stuck. So it becomes fast aground. Let's find that. There we go. We're beached. We're run aground, fast aground. So we're basically immobilized. The landing craft is now useless. Landing craft can now drop its ramp, and all the units on board it can exit as per normal. The landing craft will be unable to move. If this were to be a boat instead of a landing craft, say we have an assault boat, with it carrying its units, and the assault boat fails its swamping die roll because of the heavy surf, it's gone, and these units now become waiting. Any unpossessed weapons, say there was a mortar in this thing as well that was unpossessed, would once more be lost along with the conveyance. Right, so if you're in a landing craft and you fail your swamping die roll in shallow ocean, you're just going to become fast aground. You can still drop ramp and disgorge your contents. If you're a boat, you're going to be gone, and any unpossessed weaponry will be gone as well. Now, because of the heavy surf and the currents, you're always going to be drifting in the advanced phase of the owner's turn. We make our roll in our movement phase. Now we're in the advanced phase, so we're going to be drifting down stream 1 hex. We'll have to make another swamping die roll to avoid immobilizing our landing craft. If we have our fireflies on our landing craft, get all this out of the way, and we become fast aground, again we fail our swamping die roll in our movement phase. The LC T4 can drop its ramp, and our vehicles can start moving off, assuming they still have move. So the first move would be into the water itself. We are not waterproofed. We automatically be immobilized in heavy surf. All right, so let's look at beaching and such when it applies in heavy surf. So we have our landing craft. We do our normal drifting in the advanced phase. Our next turn, we're going to come into this hex. Now we have to make a beaching die roll because, again, the waves are rough. The seas are rough. We're not necessarily going to land where we want to. Because we have 3 beachable hex sides, we have to make a die roll. So we roll our dice. We rolled a 7. Because it's 8 or less, we have no adverse effect. If, on the other hand, I rolled a 9 or 10, in this location, your landing craft would become TI, which basically means it can't do anything except it's at the mercy of the waves. If we're in the process of beaching, then we roll randomly to see which hex we get. Let's go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we're going to land on the middle one. So it's going to be randomized where you land. So if there's an obstacle in that location, you just made your day a lot worse. If you're in the process of unbeaching and you fail your beaching die roll, then again, you'll become non-stopped and unbeached. And we have a problem now is if we have our ramp down and we were to say this is a steep slope, all right, and this was not, then there's a real risk of your landing craft sinking because we're now in a deep ocean hex, and the if your ramp's down in a deep ocean, your landing craft is lost. It sinks. If, again, we're rolling 11 or 12, we become broached, waves starting to come over the gunnels, and the landing craft is now going to be destroyed. So we flip it over to the wreck side. If you're a vehicle, you're now screwed because the ramp can't come down, which means you can't get off the conveyance. Infantry can jump over the sides, over the front. You're going to do your inherent crew survival if you have any, and any passengers will be subject to morale checks. Now, once you, assuming you pass your morale check, you're going to be able to move at double the cost off of the landing craft, and you can carry on with your beach assault. The die rolls that are going to apply to the beaching die roll, you can see there. If you have an inexperienced landing craft crew, be a +1. If you're adjacent to, in this case, a steep slope beach, or even if you're on this island that's under here, right here, for example, that would be also a +1. And once more, if there's another landing craft, because of the drift, say we have another landing craft in that location, then obviously you'll get another +1 to your beaching die roll. So heavy surf is, generally speaking, a bad case, and something to be avoided if at all possible. All right, so let's look at our TI case. We rolled a 9 or 10. We are now TI. If in the process of trying to unbeach, you're considered to be non-stop and forward move, and if there's anything in the way of AB mines, again, we'll get this with the amphibious assault, but you have anti-boat mines in water obstacles, you have a chance of activating them. Right, if you have tetrahedrons in the water, you also have a real risk of running aground into that, which again, just bad news. Once more, we're going to cover this when we get to the amphibious assault. So if you roll a 9-10 and your landing craft becomes TI, again, you're going to be screwed for that turn. All right, if your landing craft in the process becomes immobilized and you don't have your ramp lowered, then you're going to become stopped. So you're no longer forward motion in terms of any defensive fire against you. If your ramp were to be down like this one is, for example, and your TI in a shallow ocean, you would now become fast aground, which again would basically immobilize you. And if this unfortunately were to happen in a deep ocean hex, again, you're going to be lost all hands on deck. Heavy surf, all that to say, is very difficult to deal with. All right, lastly, let's look at broaching effects. Again, broaching means the sides have been broached, the waves are coming over kind of thing. It's going to immobilize your landing craft. Hopefully you're in shallow ocean when this happens. If you're adjacent to a beach and in the process of beaching when this happens, once more your landing craft will be flipped over to the wreck side, and you'll have to do any normal crew survival. In this case, we have a 6 for the landing craft crew, as well as morale checks for all the infantry aboard. You must stay aboard the vehicle, and it's not until your next turn you must unload from the wreck. All right, so if you don't have enough move to exit now, you cannot stay on a wrecked landing craft. You must attempt to exit it as soon as possible. And remember, too, to unload from the landing craft that is not having its ramp down, you're going to have to pay double rounding up fractions for the move. So because it costs you 3 movement points for infantry in shallow water, you're going to have to pay 6 movement points. So you might become CX, etc., what have you, to jump off of the boat. All right, so current and drift, as we said, with heavy surf, there's always going to be a current. Typically, it's you do your research, you find out where the currents are, if it's available, that kind of information, then you can be more historically accurate. In this case, remember, we're going to have a current that goes from the bottom right to the top left. And in the attacker's advance phase, we have to worry about drifting. So our little 4 movement point landing craft, LCA, is going to go 1, 2, 3, 40 here. That's its move. Right, we'll assume that it absorbed any fire without effect. Now in my advanced phase, I will be drifting with the current down 1 hex. So if you are in vicinity of tetrahedrons or anti-boat mines, which are typically not put on the board, it's anytime you enter a hex that may have it, you'll have to make a roll, and you may or may not get an attack when you enter those kinds of locations. And you could drift on to the beach itself, depending again on the current. So if our fourth move took us here to 4105, in our advance phase, we would be drifting onto the beach, inadvertently beaching ourselves. So we still have to do the beaching die roll, but we would, at least you're safe in this regard. We're not going to be drifting into the tetrahedron, which has a chance of destroying your boat. Looking at attacks in heavy surf, let's dismount one of these squads and the leader into our steep slope shallow ocean hex. Any direct fire attacks into this location are going to get an extra +1, as well as any fire out of heavy surf is going to add a +1. Naval OBA will always have a +1 to any accuracy. Again, depending on per hex or whatever, it could be any number between 1 and 4. However, you're always going to add a +1 because of the heavy surf effects. Your observer can't necessarily see what's going on. If we had a machine gun here, for example, that wants to lay down a fire lane in this direction, it would stop at the first ocean location. It would not carry on further. All right, so remember that when it comes to fire lanes, heavy surf is going to impact the length of your fire lane. If we have a sniper in play and we roll a 2 on the sniper check, it's not going to have any effect, 1 only, to cause some kind of casualty in that location. And we have various modifiers for landing craft when they enter tetrahedron hexes, again by current, deliberately, or what have you. You'll be a -1 DRM to any attack versus it. Typically, these tetrahedrons did have anti-boat mines attached as well, so that and the conveyance, or excuse me, the materials would wreck landing craft typically, which is why you want to avoid them as much as possible. However, sometimes just works out that way. You'll be attacked with the die roll modifier. And the same thing with anti-boat mines. You'll get a +1 to your attack. All right, so let's cover some miscellaneous items, and then we can wrap this up. Bore sighting is only allowed in shallow ocean. So this AT tank here, you predetermine that we have shallow ocean hexes, which means you only have one shallow ocean. We have to pick the one hex that it applies to. Nothing in the deep ocean can obviously be bore sighted. Units that enter from off-board for purposes of lines of sight have only expended 4 move in your line of sight. So when this boat enters, even though it only cost 1 move, in terms of line of sight for to hit purposes, you would have expended 4 moves. So you're not going to get case J +1, +2. You're only going to have the +2 moving vehicle for the target. So just remember, if you're landing craft coming from off board, you've expended 4 movement points in line of sight, even though realistically you only spent 1. You can only acquire vehicle target type versus the watercraft in any kind of ocean hex. So if you're infantry, whatever reason you're firing infantry, maybe it's an assault boat, you cannot acquire. If you're firing area, you cannot acquire. It's only if you're firing vehicle target type against a landing craft that you can acquire it. Smoke is always NA except for drifting smoke. So even if this vehicle or even if this landing craft was in shallow ocean and a wreck that was on fire, so it's having a really bad day, there's no smoke available in its hex. You're only going to have drifting smoke. All right, when it comes to that point about sunk boats, not landing craft, remember just boats, like the assault boat example, we're talking here about 531 and 532. This is basically non-applicable to sinking boats in these locations here. If you're in shallow ocean, and your boat is sunk, you become wading infantry, not fording. Remember, fording doesn't apply for ocean seaborne assaults. Only wading applies. So you become wading, not forwarding, and there's a bit of a difference in the rules I'm not going to get into right now. Any support weapon that would be on the boat would be lost in the process of it being sunk. You'd only have the units themselves that would become waiting infantry. So other cases that are miscellaneous points, let's say this unit here went berserk. It would not view these units here as a known target. So if you have no enemy forces on the beach, then this would just become battle hardening, not berserk. Units in waiting, ocean hex, units in an ocean hex or in landing craft are not known targets. So any berserk heated battle status would just be changed to battle hardening. And the same goes, say, for example, we have a leader here. He would become battle hardened, not berserk. He would not be able to actually charge the leader. When it comes to parachutes and gliders, 5/8 counters landing in shallow ocean are considered waiting. If you have heavy surf, you add additional +1 to your swamping die roll. So it becomes very difficult for your glider or parachute to survive unscathed. Half-inch weapon chutes, canisters are lost in any kind of ocean hex. If a glider lands in a shallow ocean, then it's treated as if it's a fordable river, and those rules apply. If it lands in deep ocean, then it's going to be sunk, all hands. Any rubble that falls into an ocean hex immediately becomes rubble land, not ocean. So if you say you have a hinterland and an ocean hex with a cliff, and for whatever reason there's a house, rubble falls into it, that hex now becomes a rubble land and not an ocean hex. And of course, close combat is not allowed in an ocean hex. And then lastly, a couple of other things are fortifications. Most of this is going to be covered in the actual Seaborne Assault videos. However, for beach purposes, only beach obstacles can be set up in ocean reef hexes. So what are we talking there? You're looking at tetrahedrons with or without wire. You can look at wire in a beach hex, but you cannot have things like roadblocks, clearly, that kind of thing. Any of those other obstacles cannot be used in in ocean or reef hexes. Sometimes, usually typically, you're going to have some kind of seawall. All right, so let's use this graphic here as a seawall. Typically between beach and or hinterland hexes, you may have these in existence, especially in Northwest Europe, less so in the Pacific, but you may have seawalls. A seawall is one of two types, either high or low. High is basically treated like a cliff, and only commandos can climb it. Low is considered a normal wall, so you can climb over it. However, vehicles can only cross those seawalls if they have the fascine. One of the right, if you have a vehicle, in this case we have the Churchill AVRE, the engineer vehicle with the fascine. If we have this, then vehicles can climb over walls. If not, if you don't have your fascine, then you're going to be stuck basically on the beach, not able to exit off of the beach because of the wall. So the only beach obstacles that apply are things like mines and wire, and seawalls may or may not be in play, either as a low or a high. High treated like a cliff, low is treated like a wall, except that vehicles are not able to cross those low seawalls. And that's beaches. Now that's a bit of a lengthy one. Again, you could probably skip over the heavy surf. It's not optional, but typically you won't find that applying in scenarios. It makes the life too difficult for the attacker, which is why many scenarios don't deal with things like that. And or even if you look at parachuting, most airdrop scenarios, there's not very many, because it adds too much randomness to your game start, and therefore it might impede the scenario effectiveness. And if you're already handcuffed with doing a seaborne assault into heavy defenses, you don't need the heavy surf on top of that. So you can only look at the heavy surf rules when it applies and basically ignore it for the rest of the time. So the next two videos in the series are going to be focusing on the actual Seaborne Assault. So we'll be covering things like NOBA, and we'll use some examples of units actually moving to bring it all together. So we'll cover up landing craft, beaches, and the amphibious assaults, all in those seaborne invasions. Those are the next videos. See you guys later. Bye.